We hit an impasse and stop working on a problem directly, and ends with a breakthrough, the aha insight. Maya and Dunker shone a light on what occurs mentally during incubation, what nudges people towards solutions. The question that then began to hang over the field in the last half of the 20th century was how. Under what circumstances is incubation most likely to produce that aha moment in real life? Wallace, Maya, and Dunker had incorporated breaks into their theories, but none specified how long of a break was ideal, or which kind of break was best. Should we hike in the woods, like Helmholtz? Go jogging for 45 minutes? Stare into space? Some people prefer a nap, others a video game. And there are students, I wish I were one of them, who will break from the knotty calculation they're stuck on and turn to their history reading, a different species of break altogether. The religious reformer Martin Luther is said to have had some of his deepest insights on the toilet, as did the prolific French essayist Michel de Montaigne. Should we be parking ourselves there when trying to incubate? To try to answer these kinds of questions, psychologists have used old-fashioned trial and error. In more than 100 experiments over the past 50 years, they have tested scores of combinations of puzzles, incubation durations, and types of study breaks. For instance, are people able to solve more anagrams when they take a 5-minute break to play a video game, or when they take a 20-minute break to read? Daydreaming for a few minutes might be better than both, one study found, so might a ping-pong match. The most productive type of break might change entirely with other kinds of puzzles, riddles, rebus diagrams, spatial problems, and then change again when hints are given. This shifting, multidimensional experience is what scientists are trying to characterize in labs. One well-known experiment will illustrate how they do so. This experiment, conducted by two psychologists at Texas A&M University named Stephen Smith and Stephen Blankenship, used a simple word puzzle called a remote associates test, or RAT. The subjects were given 3 words, trip, house, and goal, for example, and the challenge was to find a fourth that completed a compound word with each. Field was the solution to this one, field trip, field house, and field goal. Smith and Blankenship chose these puzzles in part because they could easily manipulate the level of difficulty by providing good hints, like sports for the example above, or bad hints, in the form of wrong answers, like road, which works with trip and house but not goal. The first kind of hint is akin to Maya's swinging rope. The second is like Dunker's filled boxes, creating a level of fixedness that is hard to overcome. This experiment used the second kind, the bad clue. Smith and Blankenship wanted to know whether a short incubation break affects people differently when they're given bad hints, when they're fixed, if you'll excuse the expression, versus when they're not. They recruited 39 students and gave them 20 rat puzzles each. The students were split into 2 groups. Half were given puzzles that had misleading words in italics next to the main clues, and the other half worked on the same puzzles, but without words next to the clues. Both groups had 10 minutes to solve as many puzzles as they could, and neither group did very well. Those who worked on the fixed ones solved 2, on average, compared to 5 for the unfixed group. The psychologists then gave their participants another 10 minutes to work on the puzzles they hadn't solved the first time through. This time around, each group was subdivided, half took the retest immediately, and the other half got a 5-minute break, during which they read a science fiction story. So, 2 groups, 1 fixed and 1 not. 2 conditions within each group, incubation and no incubation. The result? The incubation break worked, but only for those who got the bad clues. They cracked about twice as many of their unsolved puzzles as the unfixed group who got a break. The authors attributed the finding to what they called selective forgetting. A fixating word temporarily blocks other possible answers, they argued, but as more time elapses, after the initial failed attempts, the retrieval block may wear off. It's as if the students' brains were temporarily frozen by the bad hints and the 5-minute break allowed for some thawing out. This occurs all the time in normal daily life, most obviously when we get unclear directions. The pharmacy is right at the end of Fowler Road, you can't miss it, and we arrive at the given spot, backtracking, circling, rechecking the street names, no pharmacy. We're sure we're missing it somehow. Finally, we sit down on a bench, stare at the birds for a few minutes, and it hits us, oh, wait, maybe he meant the other end of Fowler Road. Or, the pharmacy moved. Or he has no idea what he's talking about. The initial assumption, the pharmacy must be around here, somewhere, no longer has a stranglehold on our mind. Other options have floated in. Romantic entanglements are another classic example. We become infatuated, we think we're in love, but time loosens the grip of the fixation. We come to see exasperating flaws. Maybe she's not the one, after all. What was I thinking? In previous chapters, we've seen how forgetting can aid learning actively as a filter, and passively, allowing subsequent study to ramp up memory. Here it is again, helping in another way, with creative problem solving. As Smith and Blankenship were quick to note, selective forgetting is only one possible explanation for incubation, in these specific circumstances. And theirs was just one experiment. Others have produced slightly different results. Longer breaks are better than shorter ones. Playing a video game is as good as reading. Writing may help incubation for certain kinds of problems, such as spatial ones like the pencil problem. In each case, in each specific study, scientists have floated various theories about what's happening in the build-up to that aha moment. Maybe it's selective forgetting. Maybe it's a reimagining of the problem. Maybe it's simple free associating, the mind having had time to wander in search of ideas. No one knows for sure which process is the most crucial one, and it's likely that no one ever will. Our best guess? They all kick in at some level. What does that mean for us, then? How do we develop a study strategy, if scores of experiments are saying various, often contradictory, things? To try to make sense of the cacophony, let's return to the Isle of Pucool. How to find our Tower of Insight. The three Pucoolians are pointing in different directions, after all. It's hard to know who's being honest and who's not. What to do? Easy. Look up. The tower is 100 feet tall, and the island is flat, and the size of a city park. No complex math logic required, the tower is visible for miles. Try this on a group of friends when they're in the mood. You'll notice that some people see the answer right away, and others never come close. I didn't come close. I spent hours concocting absurd, overly complex questions like, which way would those two fellow islanders say that you would say? I wrote out the various possible answers on paper, using a math notation I'd forgotten I knew. When I finally heard the solution, it seemed somehow unfair, a cheap trick. On the contrary, taking a step back and looking around, seeing if we've used all the available information, attempting to shake our initial assumptions and start from scratch, doing a mental inventory, is a fitting metaphor for what we have to do to make sense of the recent work on incubation. Looking at each study individually is like engaging the Pucoolians one-on-one, or staring so closely at a stereogram that the third dimension never emerges. You can't see the forest for the trees. Thankfully, scientists have a method of stepping back to see the bigger picture, one they use when trying to make sense of a large number of varied results. The idea is to pool all the findings, positive and negative, and determine what the bulk of the evidence is saying. It's called meta-analysis, and it sometimes tells a clearer story than any single study, no matter how well done. In 2009, a pair of psychologists at Lancaster University in the United Kingdom did precisely this for insight-related research, ransacking available literature, even hunting down unpublished manuscripts, and producing a high-quality, conservative meta-analysis. Attanasio and Thomas C. Ormerod included 37 of the most rigorous studies and concluded that the incubation effect is real, all right, but that it does not work the same in all circumstances. CO and Ormerod divided incubation breaks into three categories. One was relaxing, like lying on the couch listening to music. Another was mildly active, like surfing the internet. The third was highly engaging, like writing a short essay or digging into other homework. For math or spatial problems, like the pencil problem, people benefit from many of these three, It doesn't seem to matter which you choose. For linguistic problems like rat puzzles or anagrams, on the other hand, breaks consisting of mild activity, video games, solitaire, TV, seem to work best. CO and Ormerod found that longer incubation periods were better than short ones, although long in this world means about 20 minutes and short closer to 5 minutes, a narrow range determined by nothing more than the arbitrary choices of researchers. They also emphasized that people don't benefit from an incubation break unless they have reached an impasse. Their definition of impasse is not precise, but most of us know the difference between a speed bump and a brick wall. Here's what matters: knock off and play a video game too soon and you get nothing. It's unlikely that scientists will ever give us specific incubation times for specific kinds of problems. That's going to vary depending on who we are and the way we work, individually. No matter. We can figure out how incubation works for ourselves by trying out different lengths of time and activities. We already take breaks from problem solving anyway, most of us. Flopping down in front of the TV for a while or jumping on Facebook or calling a friend, we take breaks and feel guilty about it. The science of insight says not only that our guilt is misplaced. It says that many of those breaks help when we're stuck. When I'm stuck, I sometimes walk around the block, or blast some music through the headphones, or wander the halls looking for someone to complain to. It depends on how much time I have. As a rule, though, I find the third option works best. I lose myself in the kvetching, I get a dose of energy, I return 20 minutes or so later, and I find that the intellectual knot, whatever it was, is a little looser. The weight of this research turns the creeping hysteria over the dangers of social media and distracting electronic gadgets on its head. The fear that digital products are undermining our ability to think is misplaced. To the extent that such diversions steal our attention from a learning that requires continuous focus, like a lecture, for instance, or a music lesson, of course they get in our way. The same is true if we spend half our study time on Facebook, or watching TV. The exact opposite is true, however, when we are stuck on a problem requiring insight and are motivated to solve it. In this case, distraction is not a hindrance, it's a valuable weapon. As for the kid in the auditorium on the morning of my presentation, I can't know for sure what it was that helped him solve the pencil problem. He clearly studied the thing when I drew those 6 pencils side by side on the chalkboard, they all did. He didn't get it right away, he was stuck. And he had several types of incubation opportunities. He was in the back with his friends, the most restless part of the auditorium, where kids were constantly distracting one another. He got the imposed break created by the sequence puzzle, which held the audience's attention for a few minutes. He also had the 20 minutes or so that passed after several students had drawn their first ideas, attempting to put all the triangles onto a flat plane. That is, he had all 3 types of the breaks that CO and Ormerod described: relaxation, mild activity, and highly engaging activity. This was a spatial puzzle, any one of those could have thrown the switch, and having 3 is better than having just 1, or 2. Let's reset the problem, then. Given 6 identical pencils, create 4 equilateral triangles, with 1 pencil forming the side of each triangle. If you haven't solved it already, try again now that you've been at least somewhat occupied by reading this chapter. Got the answer yet? I'm not going to give it away, I've provided too many hints already. But I will show you what the 11-year-old scratched on the board. Take that, Archimedes. That's a stroke of mad kid genius you won't see in any study or textbook, nor in early discussions of the puzzle, going back more than 100 years. He incubated that one all on his own. Here's a famous one that used to crease the eyebrows of my grandparents' generation. A doctor in Boston has a brother who is a doctor in Chicago, but the doctor in Chicago doesn't have a brother at all. How is that possible? Most people back then just assumed that any doctor must be a man, and thus came up with tangled family relations based on that mental representation. The answer, of course, is that the doctor in Boston is a woman. 2. You find yourself in a stadium, in front of a crowd, a pawn in a cruel life or death game. The stadium has two closed doors, a guard standing in front of each one. All you know is that behind one door is a hungry lion, and behind the other is a path out of the stadium. Escape. One guard always tells the truth, and the other always lies, but you don't know which is which. You have one question you can ask of either guard to save your life. What's the question? Chapter 7. Quitting before you're ahead. The accumulating gifts of percolation. I think of incubation, at least as scientists have described it, as a drug. Not just any drug, either, but one that's fast-acting, like nicotine, and remains in the system for a short period of time. Studies of incubation, remember, have thus far looked almost exclusively at short breaks, of 5 to 20 minutes. Those quick hits are of primary interest when investigating how people solve problems that, at their core, have a single solution that is not readily apparent. Geometric proofs, for example. Philosophical logic. Chemical structures. The pencil problem. Taking an incubation pill here and there, when stuck, is powerful learning medicine, at least when dealing with problems that have right and wrong answers. It is hardly a cure-all, though. Learning is not reducible to a series of discrete puzzles or riddles. After all, it's not a track meet where we only have to run sprints. We have to complete decathlons, too, all those assignments that require not just one solution or skill but many, strung together over time. Term papers. Business plans. Construction blueprints. Software platforms. Musical compositions, short stories, poems. Working through such projects is not like puzzle solving, where the solution suddenly strikes. No, completing these is more like navigating a labyrinth, with only occasional glimpses of which way to turn. And doing it well means stretching incubation out, sometimes way out. To solve messier, protracted problems, we need more than a fast-acting dose, a short break here and there. We need an extended release pill. Many of us already take longer breaks, after all, an hour, a day, a week, more, when working through some tangled project or other. We step away repeatedly, not only when we're tired but often because we're stuck. Part of this is likely instinctive. We're hoping that the break helps clear away the mental fog so that we can see a path out of the thicket. The largest trove of observations on longer-term incubation comes not from scientists but artists, particularly writers. Not surprisingly, their observations on the creative process can be a little precious, even discouraging. My subject enlarges itself, becomes methodized and defined, and the whole, though it be very long, stands almost complete and finished in my mind, so that I can survey it, like a fine picture or a beautiful statue, at a glance, reads a letter attributed to Mozart. That's a nice trick if you can pull it off. Most creative artists cannot, and they don't hesitate to say so. Here's the novelist Joseph Heller, for example, describing the circumstances in which valuable ideas are most likely to strike. I have to be alone. A bus is good. Or walking the dog. Brushing my teeth was marvelous, it was especially so for Catch-22. Often when I am very tired, just before going to bed, while washing my face and brushing my teeth, my mind gets very clear. And produces a line for the next day's work, or some idea way ahead. I don't get my best ideas while actually writing. Here's another, from the poet A. Houseman, who would typically take a break from his work in the trough of his day to relax. Having drunk a pint of beer at luncheon, beer is a sedative to the brain and my afternoons are the least intellectual portion of my life. I would go out for a walk of 2 or 3 hours. As I went along, thinking of nothing in particular, only looking at things around me following the progress of the seasons, there would flow into my mind, with sudden unaccountable emotion, a line or two of verse, sometimes a whole stanza at once, accompanied, not preceded, by a vague notion of the poem which they were destined to form part of. Houseman was careful to add that it was not as if the entire poem wrote itself. There were gaps to be filled, he said, gaps that had to be taken in hand and completed by the mind, which was apt to be a matter of trouble and anxiety, involving trial and disappointment, and sometimes ending in failure. Okay, so I cherry-picked these quotes. But I cherry-picked them for a reason, because they articulate so clearly an experience that thousands of creative types have described less precisely since the dawn of introspection. Heller and Hausman deliver a clear blueprint. Creative leaps often come during downtime that follows a period of immersion in a story or topic, and they often come piecemeal, not in any particular order, and in varying size and importance. The creative leap can be a large, organizing idea, or a small, incremental step, like finding a verse, recasting a line, perhaps changing a single word. This is true not just for writers but for designers, architects, composers, mechanics, anyone trying to find a workaround, or to turn a flaw into a flourish. For me, new thoughts seem to float to the surface only when fully cooked, one or two at a time, like dumplings in a simmering pot. Am I putting myself in the same category as Hausman and Heller? I am. I'm putting you there, too, whether you're trying to break the chokehold of a 2.5 GPA or you're sitting on a full ride offer from Oxford. Mentally, our creative experiences are more similar than they are different. This longer-term, cumulative process is distinct enough from the short-term incubation we described in the last chapter that it warrants another name. Let's call it percolation. Let's take it as given that it exists, and that it's a highly individual experience. We can't study percolation in any rigorous way, and even if we could, there's no telling whether what works for Heller or Hausman is right for anyone else. What we can do, is mine psychological science for an explanation of how percolation must work. We can then use that to fashion a strategy for creative projects. And creative is the key word here. By our definition, percolation is for building something that was not there before, whether it's a term paper, a robot, an orchestral piece, or some other labyrinthine project. To deconstruct how that building process unfolds, we'll venture into a branch of science known as social psychology, which seeks to elucidate the dynamics of motivation and goal formation, among other things. Unlike learning scientists, who can test their theories directly, social psychologists depend on simulations of social contexts. Their evidence, then, is more indirect, and we must keep that in mind as we consider their findings. But that evidence, when pieced together, tells a valuable story. Berlin in the 1920s was the cultural capital of the West, a convergence of artistic, political, and scientific ideas. The Golden Twenties, the restless period between the wars, saw the rise of German Expressionism, the Bauhaus school of design, and the theater of Bertolt Brecht. Politics was a topic of intense debate. In Moscow, a revolutionary named Vladimir Lenin had formed a confederation of states under a new political philosophy, Marxism. Dire economic circumstances across Germany were giving rise to calls for major reforms. The world of science was tilting on its axis, too. New ideas were coming quickly, and they were not small ones. An Austrian neurologist named Sigmund Freud had invented a method of guided free association, called psychoanalysis, which appeared to open a window on the human soul. A young physicist in Berlin named Albert Einstein, then director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics, had published his theories of relativity, forever redefining the relationship between space, time, and gravity. Physicists like Max Born and Werner Heisenberg were defining a new method to understand the basic properties of matter. Anything seemed possible, and one of the young scientists riding this intellectual updraft was a 37-year-old psychologist at the University of Berlin named Kurt Lewin. Lewin was a star in the emerging field of social psychology, who among other things was working on a theory of behavior, based on how elements of personality, diffidence, say, or aggressive tendencies, played out in different social situations. Lewin was a charismatic, open-minded man who attracted a loyal following of younger students, whom he often met, after hours, at a cafe near campus. It was a less formal setting than his office, a place to brainstorm over coffee or beer, and one afternoon he noticed something curious. Lewin was meeting with a student of his, Bluma Zaganek, a young Lithuanian in search of a research project. On that afternoon one of the two, accounts vary, noticed something about the cafe's waiters: they never wrote down orders. They kept them in their head, adding items mentally: another espresso, a cup of tea, a slice of kuchen, until the bill was paid. Yet once the bill was paid, if, after paying, you questioned what was on the tab, they'd have forgotten the entire order. No recollection at all. It was as if, once that order was settled, the waiter's mind checked off the box and moved on, dropping the entire experience from memory. Lewin and Zeigarnik both knew that this wasn't a matter of orders falling out of what scientists call short-term memory, the 30 seconds or so during which we can hold, say, a phone number in mind. The waiters could remember orders for a half hour, sometimes longer. What was going on here mentally? Lewin and Zeigarnik came up with a hypothesis: perhaps unfinished jobs or goals linger in memory longer than finished ones. If nothing else, Zeigarnik now had her research project. She put the question more specifically: what's the difference in memory between an interrupted activity and an uninterrupted one? She recruited 164 students, teachers, and children to take part in an experiment and told them they'd be given a series of assignments to complete as rapidly and correctly as possible. The assignments came one at a time and consisted of tasks like making a box out of a sheet of cardboard, sculpting a dog out of clay, or solving a word puzzle. Most of the subjects could complete them in 3 to 5 minutes, when allowed to, that is. Zeigarnik periodically interrupted their work, stopping them in the middle of an assignment and giving them another one to work on instead. The interruptions were random, and without explanation. At the end, after 18 to 22 assignments, some interrupted and left unfinished and some not, Zeigarnik asked the test subjects to write down as many of those assignments as they could remember. Those lists told the story: on average, participants remembered 90% more of the interrupted and unfinished assignments than the ones they'd completed. Not only that, the interrupted and unfinished jobs were at the top of their lists, the first ones they wrote down. The completed ones, if remembered at all, came at the end. So far as amount of time is concerned, the advantage should lie with completed tasks, since a subject who completed a task naturally spent a longer time with it than one who did not, Zeigarnik wrote. Was it possible, she wondered, that the shock of being interrupted makes an experience more memorable? Zeigarnik performed another version of the study on a new group of participants. This time every assignment the subjects worked on was interrupted. Some of the assignments were completed, after a short break, others were not. The results, however, were nearly identical in one characteristic to the first experiment: people remembered about 90% more of the small jobs they hadn't finished. Running still more trials, Zeigarnik found that she could maximize the effect of interruption on memory by stopping people at the moment when they were most engrossed in their work. Interestingly, being interrupted at the worst time seemed to extend memory the longest. As everyone knows, Zeigarnik wrote, it is far more disturbing to be interrupted just before finishing a letter than when one has only begun. Once people become absorbed in an assignment, they feel an urge to finish, and that urge builds as the job moves closer to completion. The desire to complete the task may at first have been only a quasi-need, she concluded, but later, through losing oneself in the task, a genuine need arises. In 1931, soon after publishing her work on interruption, Zeigarnik moved to Moscow with her husband, Albert, who had taken a position at the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Trade. She secured a job at the prestigious Institute of Higher Nervous Activity. Their good fortune didn't last, however. In 1940, Albert was arrested on charges of spying for Germany and sent to a prison camp in Lubyanka, leaving Bluma in Moscow to manage a job and 2 young children. She continued to work as a psychologist, gradually cut off ties with Western colleagues to avoid any taint of suspicion, and died in 1988, leaving behind virtually no trace of her research. Yet the implications of her work survived, and then some. The Zeigarnik effect, as it's now known, became a foundational contribution to the study of goals and goal formation. When we think about goals, we tend to think in terms of dreams. Restoring a classic car. Living abroad. Starting a business. Writing a novel. Running a marathon. Being a better dad. Finding a stable relationship. For psychologists, However, a goal isn't nearly so grand. A goal is anything we want to possess or achieve and haven't yet, whether it's short-term or long-term, getting a PhD or getting dressed. According to that definition, our heads are full of goals every waking minute, and they're all competing for our attention. Should we walk the dog, or make coffee first? Help Junior pack for camp, or catch up on some work? Go to the gym, or practice Spanish? Zeigarnik's studies on interruption revealed a couple of the mind's intrinsic biases, or built-in instincts, when it comes to goals. The first is that the act of starting work on an assignment often gives that job the psychological weight of a goal, even if it's meaningless. The second is that interrupting yourself when absorbed in an assignment extends its life in memory and, according to her experiments, pushes it to the top of your mental to-do list. Most interruptions are annoying, especially if it's a busybody neighbor, or the cat needing to be let out, or a telemarketer calling when you're in the middle of an important work assignment. But deliberate self-interruption is something else altogether. It's what Dickens did so well in his novels, with cliffhanger endings for each chapter. Or what TV writers do when closing out one season and priming the audience for the next. The final episode ends with a scream, footsteps in a dark corridor, a relationship unexpectedly soured or kindled. This kind of interruption creates suspense and, according to the Zeigarnik effect, pushes the unfinished episode, chapter, or project to the top of our minds, leaving us to wonder what comes next. Which is exactly where we want it to be if we're working on something long-term and demanding. The first element of percolation, then, is that supposed enemy of learning, interruption. The Bijzoldrop-dubbelzoet is a Dutch black licorice drop the size of a plug nickel. Bijzoldrops are an acquired taste, slightly sweet and very salty, and best served with a cool glass of water. For our purposes, the important thing to know is that bijzels make you thirsty, and fast, which is why a group of scientists in the Netherlands used them in a 2001 experiment to measure the effect of goals on perception. The group, led by the psychologist Henk Arts at Leiden University, began their trial the way so many scientists do, by lying. Researchers often attempt to disguise a study's true purpose so participants don't just play along or deliberately undermine the results. In this case, Arts recruited 84 undergraduates for what he described as a study of, get this, how well people can detect letters with their tongue under different taste conditions. The students were divided into two groups. One group got 3 Bijzoldrops, each branded with a letter. They had a minute to eat each candy and try to name the letter printed on it. The other group, the control group, received no candy at all. They were given instructions to trace 3 simple figures on paper, a form of busywork that had nothing to do with the study's aim. Afterward, the experimenter led the participants, one at a time, into a room he described as his office, to fill out a 1-minute questionnaire on unrelated topics. The questions had nothing to do with the aim of the study, either. The room itself did. It looked like your standard academic office, a small space with a chair and desk, papers, books, pencils, a stack of folders, and a computer. Scattered about were several drink-related items, a water bottle, a glass, cups, an empty soda can. After finishing the questionnaire, each participant sat in that office, by him or herself, for 4 minutes. The experimenter then returned and brought the person back to the lab room for a surprise quiz. Each participant was given 4 minutes to write down as many objects in the office as he or she could remember. By this time, the participants must have been wondering what on earth this had to do with detecting letters with their tongues, let alone science, but they did, as they were told. Some recalled only 1 item, and others a half dozen. Nothing surprising there, some participants were likely daydreaming for those 4 minutes and others scanning the bookshelves. It was what they wrote down that the psychologists were interested in, and that's where a significant difference became clear. The group that had been given the Bijzoldrops remembered twice as many drink-related items as the control group. They were thirsty, and that influenced what they noticed in the office and remembered later, even if they weren't aware why they recalled those things. The experiment was a clever demonstration of a fairly straightforward principle of social psychology: having a goal foremost in mind tunes our perceptions to fulfilling it. And that tuning determines, to some extent, where we look and what we notice. The results suggest that basic needs and motives cause a heightened perceptual readiness to register environmental cues that are instrumental to satisfying those needs, the authors concluded. It can foster the reduction of thirst by helping us to detect a can of Coke or a cool glass of beer that would go unnoticed under other circumstances. On the surface, this is common sense, right? Of course we look for a drinking fountain when we're thirsty, or a snack machine when hungry. Keep in mind, though, that the thirsty students in this study were more likely than the others to notice not just bottles of water or cans of soda but anything in the room that was drink-related: a cup, a saucer, a bottle cap. Whether they were aware of it or not, their thirst activated a mental network that was scavenging the landscape for anything linked to liquid. In dozens of studies going back decades, psychologists have shown that this principle of tuned perception applies not only to elemental needs like thirst, but to any goal we hold foremost in mind. This is a familiar experience, too. As soon as we decide to buy a certain brand of handbag or model of smartphone or style of jeans, we begin seeing that product far more often than we had before, in stores, at the mall, walking down the street. I remember the first time this phenomenon occurred to me. I was 11 years old, and I'd just bought my first pair of Converse All-Stars, which were standard issue, way back when, for boys my age. But I didn't want the usual colors, white or black. No, the ones I wanted were green. Bright Kelly green. I remember bringing them home and putting them on and going out into the world, and suddenly feeling like, hey, wait a minute, those sneakers were everywhere. I must have counted a half-dozen pairs of green ones the first day I wore them. Not only that, I started to notice other, more exotic colors, as well as different styles and laces. Within weeks, I had a detailed mental map of a particular subculture, preteen Converse wearers in 1971 suburban Chicago, a subtle, intricate universe that was previously invisible to me. And I did this without studying at all, at least, not in the usual sense. What does this have to do with finishing a research paper on, say, the Emancipation Proclamation? Everything, actually. Academic pursuits are goals, too, and they can tune our perceptions in the same way that a powerful thirst or a new pair of sneakers can. When we're in the middle of that paper, for example, we're far more attuned to race references all around us. A story about race riots or affirmative action in the media. An offhand comment by a friend. A review of a Lincoln biography in the newspaper. Even the way people of different races arrange themselves at a bar, or on a subway car. Once a goal becomes activated, it trumps all others and begins to drive our perceptions, our thoughts, our attitudes, as John Barge, a psychologist at Yale University, told me. So the question is, how, then, do we most effectively activate that goal? By interrupting work on it at an important and difficult moment, propelling the assignment, via the Zeigarnik effect, to the top of our mind. This heightened awareness doesn't always deliver the big breakthrough or some golden, clarifying idea for our paper, of course. That's fine. If it provides a detail here or there, a sentence for the introduction, or a simple transition idea, it's free money and it earns interest, incrementally sharpening our acuity so we can recognize bigger ideas, the flashes of clarifying insight, that creative people lust after. As the French microbiologist Louis Pasteur famously put it, chance favors the prepared mind. Seeing that quote always made me think, okay, but how does one prepare for chance? I have a better idea now, thanks to social psychology. I'd put it differently than Pasteur, if less poetically: chance feeds the tuned mind. My favorite articulation of how this happens comes from the novelist and short story writer Eudora Welty. In a 1972 interview, Welty was asked where her dialogue comes from. Once you're into a story, she replied, everything seems to apply. What you hear on the city bus is exactly what your character would say on the page you were writing. Wherever you go, you meet part of your story. I guess you are tuned in for it, and the right things are sort of magnetized, if you can think of your ears as magnets. What's left unsaid here is that those overheard comments on the bus not only animate a character, they help move the story. The information we pick up isn't merely dumped into a mental ledger of overheard conversation. It also causes a ripple in our thinking about the story, our research paper, our design project, or our big presentation. When working on that paper about the Emancipation Proclamation, we're not only tuned into racial dynamics on the subway car, we're also more aware of our reactions to what we're noticing. This is not an obvious or trivial point. Remember, there's an incredible cacophony of competing thoughts running through our minds at any given time. What we hear depends on the demands, distractions, or anxieties of the moment. I am proposing that, in this example, we're better able to hear our internal dialogue about race above that chatter, and that conversation, too, provides fodder for our work. Can I prove this? No. I don't know how anyone could. But that doesn't mean no one's tried, and made an invisible process visible. Let's return to the classroom, then. When I was in high school or college, trying to write an essay or research paper, I was forever looking for someone else's thinking to rely on. I would hunt for some article written by an expert that was as similar as possible to the assignment. This perfect model essay rarely existed, or I never found it, so I'd end up stringing together quotes and ideas from the articles and books I had looked through. If someone else said it, I figured it must be insightful. In my defense, this isn't all bad. When looking into the emergence of Christianity in ancient Rome, we should know who the experts are and what they think. The problem is that, when we're embarking on a research project, especially when we're younger, we don't necessarily know how to identify those intellectual landmarks. Often, we don't even know they exist. Through high school and much of college, I remember longing for someone to tell me how to proceed, sinking into a passive, tentative frame of mind, a fear of embarrassment trumping any real curiosity or conviction. The result was that I rarely consulted the wisdom of the one thinker I had easy access to, myself. I was so busy looking for better, smarter opinions that I had trouble writing, or thinking, with any confidence. In 1992, a doctoral student in Illinois noticed the same tentative, deferential quality in her students' work. Rhonda Leathers Dively, then finishing her degree in English at Illinois State University, was teaching a group of sophomores and juniors how to write for publication in an academic journal, using authoritative sources to make a cogent argument. By the end of the course, however, she was discouraged. She'd asked her students to write 6 essays of 3 to 5 pages, each focusing on a different social, political, or cultural controversy. Hoping for sharply argued, well-informed pieces, Dively instead received what she described as cut-and-paste summaries of published scholars' work. Most alarming, the work was no better at the end of the semester than at the beginning. That was her fault, not theirs. She was failing them. Dively decided that the curriculum she followed was preventing percolation from happening. For each essay, the students had only about 2 weeks to get up to speed on difficult, nuanced topics like waste disposal, the effects of daycare on children, and drug legalization. The course, in other words, allowed for no time to meditate on the topics, no real downtime at all. So Dively decided to throw out the program. She would conduct an experiment of sorts. It would be neither controlled, nor in any way rigorous by scientific standards. This was an undergraduate writing course, not a cognitive psychology lab. Nonetheless, it was a course she could rethink from top to bottom, and she did. The next semester she taught, she scrapped the 6-essay structure, the ADHD-like jumping from one topic to another. The course would demand the same amount of writing, but in a very different format. Her students would write 1 essay, on a single topic, due at the end of the semester. But in the course of their research, they'd have 5 pre-writing assignments, all on the experience of doing the research itself. One piece would describe an interview with an expert. Another piece would define a key term and its place in the larger debate. A third piece would be a response to a controversial school of thought on their topic. Dively also required them to keep journals along the way, tracking their personal reactions to the sources they were using. Did the articles make sense? Did they agree with the main points? Was this expert or that one consistent in his or her opinions? The purpose of these steps, the pre-writing and the journal entries, was to force students to carry around their topic for the entire semester, and to think about it frequently, if not continually, to percolate, in our terminology. Dively was aware that their final essays would not necessarily be more incisive or readable than her previous classes. More time doesn't always add up to more authoritative writing, and sometimes means sinking deeper into indecision. In this case, however, her students showed her something extra. The biggest improvement, she wrote, was that they took on an expert persona, an authoritative presence capable of contributing to the scholarly exchange. At the end of the semester she surveyed her students, asking about the new format. As time goes by and I find more research, much of the information becomes embedded in me, said one. Now, I even question certain things which the author claims to be true. I realize I do not have to agree with everything in a professional journal, another said. I had a more complete understanding of the material I was dealing with because I was able to ask more questions of myself in the journal. One student openly scoffed at an article written for a beginner in environmental health in this somewhat prestigious journal. I would only recommend the reading of this article to someone with almost no knowledge of the subject. In other words, her students were no longer looking to borrow someone else's opinion. They were working to discover their own. Again, there's nothing particularly scientific about this evidence. It's one teacher's observations of one class. But what Dively did, in effect, was slow down the tape and in the process reveal how a normally invisible and usually semi or subconscious process plays out. She made percolation visible. Dively's findings might seem anecdotal if they didn't dovetail so well with the more rigorous work of experimental social psychologists. In effect, her pre-assignments were truncated steps, a form of self-interruption that kept the final paper foremost in mind, a la Zeigarnik. Having that goal continually active, unfinished, sensitized the students' minds consciously and subconsciously to relevant information all around them, like the thirsty participants in Henkartz's study. Those are the first two elements of percolation, interruption, and the tuned, scavenging mind that follows. The journal entries provided the third element, conscious reflection. Remember, Dively had the students make regular entries on what they thought about the sources they used, the journal articles and interviews. Their thinking evolved, entry by entry, as they accumulated more knowledge. Assembled into a coherent whole, this research, from Zeigarnik, Utz, Dively, and other social psychologists who've spent the past decades studying goal fulfillment, takes some of the mystery out of the creative process. No angel or muse is whispering to anyone here. Percolation is a matter of vigilance, of finding ways to tune the mind so that it collects a mix of external perceptions and internal thoughts that are relevant to the project at hand. We can't know in advance what those perceptions and thoughts will look like, and we don't have to. Like the thirsty students in Utz's study, the information flows in. If more fully formed ideas seem to arrive out of the blue, it only means that that mixing happened outside of direct conscious awareness. Among scientists, there's a debate about whether percolation is largely conscious or subconscious, and the answer has interesting theoretical implications. Yet for our purposes, it's beside the point. I tend to agree with the writer Stephen King, who describes percolation as the marinating of ideas in that place that's not quite the conscious but not quite the subconscious. Either way, we take what we can get, when we get it. What does this mean for a learning strategy? It suggests that we should start work on large projects as soon as possible and stop when we get stuck, with the confidence that we are initiating percolation, not quitting. My tendency as a student was always to procrastinate on big research papers and take care of the smaller stuff first. Do the easy reading. Clean the kitchen. Check some things off the to-do list. Then, once I finally sat down to face the big beast, I'd push myself frantically toward the finish line and despair if I didn't make it. Wrong. Quitting before I'm ahead doesn't put the project to sleep, it keeps it awake. That's phase 1, and it initiates phase 2, the period of gathering string, of casual data collecting. Phase 3 is listening to what I think about all those incoming bits and pieces. Percolation depends on all three elements, and in that order. Over the years, I've found that starting in on a labor-intensive project before doing the smaller stuff has an added bonus. Psychologically speaking, it shrinks the job. The project doesn't continue to grow each day. I've already broken the skin and, as a result, the job becomes more manageable. It's easier to sit down and resume working. And even if I can't get my head around some concept after a few hours of work, I know that taking a break is only a first step. As one of my favorite professors used to say, the definition of a mathematician is a person who carries around the concept in their head for long enough that, one day, they sit down and realize that it's familiar. I see percolation as a means of using procrastination in my favor. When I'm engrossed in a complex assignment, I try to do a little each day, and if I get some momentum in one session, I ride it for a while, and then stop. In the middle of some section, when I'm stalled, I return and complete it the next workday. Admittedly, we have focused largely on one kind of creating in this chapter, writing, but that's because writers talk about it endlessly and because, in a critical sense, writing about something is discovering what you think about it. Yet anyone who becomes a productive artist, builder, designer, or scientist engages in similar psychological processes to refine and finish their work and often have a hard time turning them off. They allow percolation to happen instinctively, because they've discovered through experience that a tuned mind usually delivers the goods, or at least some of the goods. Knowing just that will help you move through complex creative projects with much more confidence, and much less despair. I'll leave it to others to explain Mozart. Chapter 8. Being mixed up. Interleaving as an aid to comprehension. At a certain age, 9, 10, 11, we were all there once. Most of us are capable of the kind of blind devotion it takes to master some single, obscure skill that we've decided is central to our identity. Maybe it's drawing a horse, or copying a guitar solo, or dribbling a basketball behind our back. Maybe it's an ollie, that elementary skateboarding move, a kind of standing jump where the feet never leave the board. We don't need a manual to tell us what to do, we just do it. Repeatedly. Head down, nose to the grindstone, just like we've been told. A belief in repetition is in the cultural water supply, in every How to Succeed manual and handbook, every sports and business autobiography. There's a reason that coaches, music instructors, and math teachers often run their students through drills, followed by more drills. Perform 100 A- scales in an afternoon and you will see progress. Do another 200 and you'll see more still. Our faith in repetition never leaves us, not entirely. I sometimes think, if only I could channel my childlike devotion today when trying to learn something new, I'd channel it into the piano, or genetics, or mechanics. I'd practice like a machine, one skill at a time, until each one was automatic, driven deep into the marrow. Play Elgar, save some lives, fix the car when it broke down. At some level, I sort of believe it could still happen, given enough time. Some psychologists and writers have even tried to quantify that time. The path to exceptional performance, they argue, is through practice, 10,000 hours of it, to be exact. The gist of that rule is hard to resist, even if the number itself is arbitrary, because we read it in terms of repetition, as well as quantity. As the common exhortation goes, don't practice until you get it right. Practice until you can't get it wrong. Then I remember what happened in my own life when I did put in the time. I was Mr. Repetition as a kid. As a student, as a music student, as an athlete. I was the one who did 300 ollies in an afternoon, never quite getting it right. There I was, scraping up the driveway, only to look up and see some kid who didn't have anywhere near my determination roll by, popping clean jumps without even thinking about it. Same for the behind-the-back dribble, the guitar solo, the inside skate stop in hockey. I wanted it so bad, I'd throw myself into practicing but somehow never got good, while other kids who weren't putting in nearly the same amount of dedicated time picked up the skills without seeming to sweat the details. Were they just naturals? Did they have private teachers? Secret handshakes? I had no idea. I blamed my own lack of native gifts and kept looking for something that would come easily. What I never did was stop to ask whether my approach to practice was, in fact, the right one. Nor did anyone else, at least not back in the early 1970s. At that time, scientists thought about practice in the same way we all did: the more, the better. To put it in precise terms, psychologists argued that any variation in the practice schedule that makes the target skill, whether in skating, algebra, or grammar, more immediate, more frequent, and more accurate improves learning. Brute force repetition does that, and everyone who truly masters a skill has done at least some of it, usually lots. That's the part they tend to remember later on, too, the repetition, and not other innovations or alterations they might have incorporated along the way. One of the first hints that there might be another way came in a 1978 experiment by a pair of researchers at the University of Ottawa. Robert Kerr and Bernard Booth were trained in kinetics, the study of human movement. Kineticists often work closely with trainers and coaches, and they're interested in the factors that contribute to athletic ability, injury recovery, and endurance. In this case, Kerr and Booth wanted to know how two distinct kinds of practice affected a simple, if somewhat obscure, skill, beanbag tossing. They recruited 36 8-year-olds who were enrolled in a 12-week Saturday morning PE course at a local gym and split them into two groups. The researchers ran both groups through a warm-up session of target practice to get the kids used to the game, and an awkward game it was, too. The children were asked to toss small golf ball-sized beanbags from a kneeling position at bullseyes on the floor. But they did so while wearing a harness that held a screen blocking their eyes. They took each shot blindly, removed the screen to see where it landed, then took the next shot. On an initial trial, the two groups scored equally well, displaying no discernible difference in skill level. Then they began regular practice sessions. Each child had 6 practice sessions, taking 24 shots every time. One group practiced on one target, a bullseye that was just 3 feet away. The other group practiced on 2 targets, one that was 2 feet away and another that was 4 feet away, alternating their shots. That was the only difference. At the end of the 12-week course, the researchers gave the children a final test on performance, but only on the 3-foot target. This seems unfair. One group was practicing on the 3-foot target the whole time, and the other not at all. The group that practiced at 3 feet should have had a clear advantage. Yet it didn't turn out that way. The kids in the mixed target group won this competition, and handily. Their average distance away from the target was much smaller than their peers on the final test. What was going on? Kerr and Booth ran the same experiment again in 12-year-olds, just to make sure the finding held up. It did. Not only that, but the result was even more dramatic in the older kids. Was it luck? Did the better groups have a few ringers? Not at all, reported Kerr and Booth. A varied practice schedule may facilitate the initial formation of motor schema, they wrote, the variation working to enhance movement awareness. In other words, varied practice is more effective than the focused kind, because it forces us to internalize general rules of motor adjustment that apply to any hittable target. A big idea, if true. It might have been a fluke, given the strangeness of the task, blind beanbag tossing. Not that it mattered at the time, in part because no one was paying attention. The beanbag experiment was as obscure as they come. Yet even if the study had made the nightly news, it's not likely to have changed many minds, certainly not among the academics studying memory. Kinetics and cognitive psychology are worlds apart in culture and in status. One is closer to brain science, the other to gym class. A beanbag study with a bunch of 8-year-olds and 12-year-olds wasn't about to alter centuries of assumptions about how the brain acquires new skills. At least not right away. Psychologists who study learning tend to fall into one of two camps, the motor movement, or the verbal academic. The former focuses on how the brain sees, hears, feels, develops reflexes, and acquires more advanced physical abilities, like playing sports or an instrument. The latter investigates conceptual learning of various kinds, language, abstract ideas, and problem solving. Each camp has its own vocabulary, its own experimental paradigms, its own set of theories. In college, they are often taught separately, in different courses: motor and perceptual skills and cognition and memory. This distinction is not an arbitrary one. Before we go any further, let's revisit, briefly, the story of Henry Molaison, the Hartford man whose 1953 surgery for epilepsy severely damaged his ability to form new memories. After the surgery, Molaison's brain could not hold on to any describable memories, such as names, faces, facts, and personal experiences. The surgeon had removed the hippocampus from both hemispheres of his brain. Without those, Molaison could not move short-term memories into long-term storage. He could, however, form new motor memories. In one of the experiments described in Chapter 1, Molaison learned to trace a star while watching his drawing hand in a mirror. He became more and more adept at this skill over time, even though he had no memory of ever practicing it. A major implication of the Molaison studies was that the brain must have at least two biological systems for handling memory. One, for declarative memories, is dependent on a functioning hippocampus. The other, for motor memories, is based in different brain organs, no hippocampus required. The two systems are biologically distinct, so it stood to reason that they're functionally distinct, too, in how they develop, strengthen, and fade. Picking up Spanish is not the same as picking up Spanish guitar, and so psychology has a separate tradition to characterize each. In the early 1990s, a pair of colleagues at UCLA decided to try something radical. They would combine the two traditions, motor and verbal, into a single graduate seminar, which they called Principles of Motor and Verbal Learning. The two researchers, Richard A. Schmidt, a motor learning specialist, and the ever-present Robert Bjork, a verbal learning expert, thought students would gain a better understanding of the main distinctions between their respective fields and how each type of learning is best taught. Dick and I just assumed we'd lay out what the differences were between motor and verbal, nothing more than that, Bjork told me. But as we got deeper into it, the whole project changed course. An odd signal echoed down through the literature they saw. For starters, they stumbled upon the neglected beanbag study, and took its conclusions at face value, as valid. They then searched the literature to see if they could find other studies in which mixed or interrupted practice sessions led to better performance over time than focused ones. If the beanbag result was solid, and Kerr and Booth were correct in arguing that it revealed a general principle of learning, then it should show up in other experiments comparing different practice techniques. And so it did, in papers by researchers who weren't familiar with Kerr and Booth's work at all. In 1986, for instance, researchers at Louisiana State University tested how well 30 young women learned three common badminton serves. The short serve, the long, and the drive each has a distinct trajectory and takes some practice to hit well. To make a short serve, the player has to hit the shuttlecock just over the net so that it lands in the front third of the opposing court. A long serve passes at least 2.5 meters above the net and lands in the back third of the opposite court. A drive splits the difference and darts downward to the midline on the other side. The researchers, Sina Good and Richard McGill, judged the serves by two criteria: where they landed and where they passed over the net. They split the women into 3 groups of 10, each of which practiced according to the same schedule, for 3 days a week over 3 weeks, 36 serves at a time. The sessions themselves were different, however. Group A performed blocked practice, rehearsing only one type of serve per session, doing 36 short ones on one day, for instance, 36 long ones the next session, and 36 drives the next. Group B performed serial practice, trying the serves in a given order, short, then long, then drive, repeatedly. Group C practiced randomly, trying any serve they wanted but no more than 2 of the same ones in a row. By the end of the 3 weeks, Each participant had practiced each serve the same number of times, give or take a few for those in the random group. Good and McGill wanted not only to compare the relative effectiveness of each type of practice schedule. They also wanted to measure how well the participants' skills transferred to a new condition. Transfer is what learning is all about, really. It's the ability to extract the essence of a skill or a formula or word problem and apply it in another context, to another problem that may not look the same, at least superficially. If you've truly mastered a skill, you carry it with you, so to speak. Good and McGill measured transfer in a subtle, clever way. On their final test of skill, they made one small adjustment: the participants served from the left side of the court, even though they'd practiced only on the right. During the test, the examiner called out one skill after another: hit me a drive. Okay, now a short serve. Now give me a long one. Each participant hit each serve the same number of times on the final test, 6, though never two of the same kind in a row. Good and McGill then rated each serve, according to its arc and placement, on a scale from 0 to 24. The winner? Team Random, by a long shot. It scored an average of 18, followed by the serial group, at 14. The blocked practicers, who'd focused on one serve at a time, did the worst, with an average of 12, and this despite having appeared, for most of the 3 weeks, to be improving the most. They were leading the pack going into week 3, but come game time, they collapsed. The authors weren't entirely sure what caused such a dramatic reversal. Yet they had a hunch. Interfering with concentrated or repetitive practice forces people to make continual adjustments, they reasoned, building a general dexterity that, in turn, sharpens each specific skill. Which, by the way, is exactly what the beanbag study concluded. But Good and McGill then took it one step further. All that adjusting during a mixed practice session, they wrote, also enhances transfer. Not only is each skill sharper, it's performed well regardless of context, whether indoors or out, from the right side of the court or the left. The general goal of practice is to transfer to a game, the pair concluded. A game situation varies from event to event, making random testing the best condition to appraise the effectiveness of practice. Schmidt and Bjork knew that this experiment, like the beanbag toss, proved nothing on its own. It was just one study. But there was a scattering of still others, of keyboard ability, of video game skills, of precise arm movements, and they all had one thing in common: whenever researchers scrambled practice sessions, in one form or another, people improved more over time than if their practice was focused and uninterrupted. One way to think about this is in terms of practice versus performance. During practice we have a measure of control. We can block out or avoid distractions, we can slow down if needed, and most important, we decide which skill or move or formula we want to rehearse before actually doing it. We're in charge. Performance is another story. Growing up, all of us knew kids who were exceptional in practice but only mediocre come game time. And vice versa, kids who looked awkward in drills and then came alive when it mattered, during competition, or performing in front of an audience. You can practice the step-over soccer move 1,000 times in your front yard, but doing it at full speed with 2 opposing players running at you is much harder. It's no longer a single move anymore, practiced in isolation, but one step in an ever-changing, fast-paced dance. The incorporation of these random demands is what made Kerr and Booth's observation plausible, and Schmidt and Bjork knew well enough that the principle wasn't only applicable to physical skills. Digging out verbal memories on a dime requires a mental, if not physical, suppleness that doesn't develop in repetitive practice as fast as it could. In one previous experiment, Bjork and T.K. Landauer of Bell Laboratories had students try to memorize a list of 50 names. Some of the names were presented for study and then tested several times in succession. Other names were presented once and tested, but the test came after the study session was interrupted. In other words, each student studied one set of names in an unperturbed session and the other set in an interrupted one. Yet 30 minutes later, on subsequent tests, they recalled about 10% more of the names they'd studied on the interrupted schedule. Focused, unharried practice held them back. It has generally been understood that any variation in practice that makes the information more immediate, more accurate, more frequent, or more useful will contribute to learning, Schmidt and Bjork wrote. Recent evidence, however, suggests that this generalization must be qualified. Qualified was a polite way to say reconsidered and possibly abandoned altogether. It's not that repetitive practice is bad. We all need a certain amount of it to become familiar with any new skill or material. But repetition creates a powerful illusion. Skills improve quickly and then plateau. By contrast, varied practice produces a slower apparent rate of improvement in each single practice session but a greater accumulation of skill and learning over time. In the long term, repeated practice on one skill slows us down. Psychologists had been familiar with many of these findings, as isolated results, for years. But it was Schmidt and Bjork's paper, New Conceptualizations of Practice, published in 1992, that arranged this constellation of disparate pieces into a general principle that can be applied to all practice, motor and verbal, academic as well as athletic. Their joint class turned out not to be devoted to contrasts, after all, but to identifying key similarities. We are struck by the common features that underlie these counterintuitive phenomena in such a wide range of skill learning situations, they concluded. At the most superficial level, it appears that systematically altering practice so as to encourage additional, or at least different, information processing activities can degrade performance during practice, but can at the same time have the effect of generating greater performance capabilities. Which activities are those? We've already discussed one example, in Chapter 4, the spacing effect. Breaking up study time is a form of interference, and it deepens learning without the learner investing more overall time or effort. Another example, explored in Chapter 3, is context change. Mixing up study locations, taking the books outside or to a coffee shop, boosts retention. Each of these techniques scrambles focused practice, also causing some degree of forgetting between sessions. In their Forget to Learn theory, Robert and Elizabeth Bjork called any technique that causes forgetting a desirable difficulty, in that it forces the brain to work harder to dig up a memory or skill, and that added work intensifies subsequent retrieval and storage strength. But there's another technique, and it goes right back to the long-lost beanbag study. Remember, the kids who did best on the final test hadn't practiced on the 3-foot target at all. They weren't continually aiming at the same target, like their peers, doing 100 A- scales in a row. Nor were they spacing their practice, or changing rooms, or being interrupted by some psychologist in a lab coat. They were simply alternating targets. It was a small variation, only a couple of feet, but that alteration represents a large idea, and one that has become the focus of intense study at all levels of education. Let's leave the bin bags and badminton behind for now and talk about something that's more likely to impress friends, strangers, and potential mates, art. I'm not talking about creating art, I'm talking about appreciating it. One of the first steps in passing oneself off as an urbane figure is having some idea who actually created the painting you're staring at. Remarking on Manet's use of light while standing in front of a Matisse can blow your cover quickly, and force a stinging retreat to the information desk for some instructional headphones. Yet learning to identify an artist's individual touch, especially one who has experimented across genres and is not among history's celebrities, a Van Gogh or a Picasso or an O'Keeffe, is not so easy. The challenge is to somehow feel the presence of the artist in the painting, and there's no simple recipe for doing so. What's the difference between a Vermeer, a De Heem, and a Van Everdingen, for example? I couldn't pick any one of these Dutch masters out of a lineup, never mind identify the creative signatures that separate one from the others. The different subjects chosen by Vermeer and De Heem and Van der Heyden and Van Everdingen are at once different ways of depicting life in 17th century Holland and different ways of expressing its domestic quality, wrote the American philosopher Nelson Goodman in one of his essays on artistic style. Sometimes features of what is exemplified, such as color organizations, are ways of exemplifying other features, such as spatial patterns. Got all that? Me neither. Goodman famously argued that the more elusive and cryptic an artist's style, the more rewarding it was for the viewer. An obvious style, easily identified by some superficial quirk, is properly decried as a mere mannerism. A complex and subtle style, like a trenchant metaphor, resists reduction to a literal formula. And there's the rub. Art appreciation is a world removed from biology, playing music, German 101, and the epic poets. There are no word pairs or chemical bonds to study, no arpeggios or verses or other basic facts, no obvious verbal or motor tasks to measure. The ability contains an element of witchcraft, frankly, and learning scientists had traditionally left the study of artistic styles to the likes of academics like Goodman. That all changed in 2006, when Robert Bjork and postdoctoral student Nate Cornell, now at Williams College, decided to test whether a form of interrupted study affected aesthetic judgment in addition to retention. The idea came from a story that one of Bjork's colleagues had told him, about taking a trip to Italy with her teenage daughter. She, the mother, was excited by the opportunity to visit great museums, such as the Uffizi and Accademia in Florence, the National and Borghese in Rome, as well as the vast Vatican collection, but she worried that the experience would be lost on her daughter, if not actively resisted. She told Bjork that she knew her daughter would get so much more out of the trip if she learned to identify Italian painters' styles, and had devised a flashcard game that taught her to do just that. Cornell and Bjork did essentially the same thing in their experiment. They chose a collection of paintings by 12 landscape artists, some of them familiar, but most by artists unfamiliar to the participants, like Marilyn Milray, Ye May, and Henri Edmond Cross. They then had a group of 72 undergraduates study the paintings on a computer screen. Half of the students studied the artists one at a time. For example, they saw one cross after another for 3 seconds each, with the name of the painter below the image. After 6 crosses, they saw 6 works by Braque, again for 3 seconds each with the artist's name below, then 6 by Ye May, and so on. Cornell and Bjork called this blocked practice, because the students studied each artist's works in a set. The other half of the participants studied the same paintings for the same amount of time, also with the artist's name below. But in their case, the paintings were not grouped together by artist, they were mixed up. Both groups studied a total of 6 paintings from each of the 12 artists. Which group would have a better handle on the styles at the end? Cornell and Bjork had the participants count backward from 547 by 3s after studying, a distraction that acted as a palate cleanser, a way to clear short-term memory and mark a clean break between the study phase and the final test. And that test, to count as a true measure of performance, could not include any of the paintings just studied. Remember, the participants in this study were trying to learn painting styles, not memorize specific paintings. If you know Braque, you should be able to identify his touch in a painting of his you've never seen before. So Cornell and Bjork had the students view 48 unstudied landscapes, one at a time, and try to match each one to its creator, by clicking on one of the 12 names. The researchers weren't sure what to expect but had reason to suspect that blocked study would be better. For one thing, no one understands exactly how people distinguish artistic styles. For another, similar studies back in the 1950s, having subjects try to learn the names of abstract drawings, found no differences. People studying the figures in blocked sets did every bit as well as those studying mixed sets. Not this time. The mixed study group got nearly 65% of the artists correct, and the blocked group only 50%. In the world of science, that's a healthy difference, so the researchers ran another trial in a separate group of undergraduates to double-check it. Once again, each student got equal doses of blocked and mixed study, blocked for 6 of the artists, mixed for the other 6. The result was the same, 65% correct for those studied in mixed sets, and 50% for those studied in blocks. A common way to teach students about an artist is to show, in succession, a number of paintings by that artist, Cornell and Bjork wrote. Counterintuitive as it may be to art history teachers, and our participants, we found that interleaving paintings by different artists was more effective than massing all of an artist's paintings together. Interleaving. That's a cognitive science word, and it simply means mixing related but distinct material during study. Music teachers have long favored a variation on this technique, switching from scales, to theory, to pieces all in one sitting. So have coaches and athletic trainers, alternating endurance and strength exercises to ensure recovery periods for certain muscles. These philosophies are largely rooted in tradition, in a person's individual experience, or in concerns about overuse. Cornell and Bjork's painting study put interleaving on the map as a general principle of learning, one that could sharpen the imprint of virtually any studied material. It's far too early to call their study a landmark. That's for a better historian than I to say, but it has inspired a series of interleaving studies among amateurs and experts in a variety of fields. Piano playing, bird watching, baseball hitting, geometry. What could account for such a big difference? Why any difference at all? Were the distinctions between styles somehow clearer when they were mixed? In their experiment, Cornell and Bjork decided to consult the participants. In a questionnaire given after the final test, they asked the students which study method, blocked or interleaved, helped them learn best. Nearly 80% rated blocked study as good or better than the mixed kind. They had no sense that mixed study was helping them, and this was after the final test, which showed that mixing provided a significant edge. That may be the most astounding thing about this technique, said John Dunlosky, a psychologist at Kent State University, who has shown that interleaving accelerates our ability to distinguish between bird species. People don't believe it, even after you show them they've done better. This much is clear: the mixing of items, skills, or concepts during practice, over the longer term, seems to help us not only see the distinctions between them but also to achieve a clearer grasp of each one individually. The hardest part is abandoning our primal faith in repetition. Math scores, however, don't lie. Despite its leadership in technical innovation and discovery, the United States has long lagged in math education, usually ranking around 9th or 10th in the world, as measured by performance in 8th graders, far behind countries like South Korea and Finland. Experts and officials are perpetually debating how to close that gap, and in the late 1980s the nation's premier organization of math teachers, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, convened a meeting of leading educators to review and reshape how the subject was taught. It was a gargantuan job and, like so many grand-scale efforts, became bitterly contentious. The central disagreement was over teaching philosophy. Do students learn most efficiently in classes that emphasize the learning of specific problem-solving techniques, like factoring and calculating slope? Or do they benefit more from classes that focus on abstract skills, like reasoning and number sense, knowing, for example, that 2 3 plus 3 5 is greater than 1, without having to find a common denominator? The former approach is bottom-up, the latter is top-down. This being education, the debate was quickly politicized. The top-down camp became progressives who wanted children to think independently rather than practice procedures by rote. The bottom-up camp became conservatives who saw value in the old ways, in using drills as building blocks. The math wars, as they were known, caused confusion among many teachers. Math education was virtually devoid of decent research at the time, so neither side had the ammunition to win the argument. The typical experiment involved academics or outside experts descending on a class or school with a novel math, history, or writing curriculum and announcing improvements that were hard to interpret, given that the measures were often new themselves, and few experiments tracked the teacher's commitment to the program. Teachers, then as now, see enough new approaches come and go over time that many become constitutionally skeptical. Plus, this clash over math was about philosophies, and in math of all subjects it is results that matter, not theories. One of the things you see that's so baffling, when you're a new teacher, is that kids who do great on unit tests, the weekly, or bi-weekly reviews, often do terribly on cumulative exams on the same material. Doug Rohrer, who was a high school math teacher in Palo Alto, California, in the late 1980s, told me, "The kids would often blame the test or even blame me explicitly, saying I gave them trick questions. What made those questions so tricky," explained Rora, "was that math students must be able to choose a strategy, not just know how to use it, and choosing a strategy is harder when an exam covers many kinds of problems. For practical teaching issues like this one, the math wars debate was irrelevant." Rora toyed with the idea of developing a different curriculum, one that rejected the idea of teaching in blocks and instead mixed problems from previously studied topics into daily homework to force students to learn how to choose appropriate solution strategies rather than blindly apply them. To solve a problem, you first have to identify what kind of problem it is. Rora was lying on his futon in his studio apartment one day, staring at the ceiling, and thought, "Okay, maybe it's time to write a textbook of mixed problems." He soon found out that someone already had. That someone was a retired Air Force officer turned math teacher in Oklahoma City. In the 1970s, John H. Saxon was teaching math at Rose State College and growing increasingly exasperated with the textbooks the college used. The book's approach left students fuzzy on the basics, and quick to forget what they'd just studied. So one day Saxon decided to write out some problem sets of his own, with the goal of building algebra skills differently, i.e., more incrementally, than the standard curriculum. His students improved fast, and soon he was developing entire lesson plans. Between 1980 and 1990, Saxon authored or co-authored 12 math textbooks for kindergarten through high school, plus a couple of college texts. His central innovation was a process of mixed review. Each homework assignment included some new technique, solving simultaneous equations, for example, along with a number of problems from previous lessons, say, solving equations for x. Saxon believed that we grasp a new technique more clearly when using it alongside other, familiar ones, gradually building an understanding of more abstract concepts along the way. His books built a following, mostly among private schools, homeschoolers, and some public districts, and he soon became a lightning rod in the math debate. Saxon was a bottom-up man. He thought the reformers were dangerous and they returned the compliment. Rora wasn't sure what he thought about the math wars or, for that matter, about Saxon. He does remember picking up the Saxon books and looking at the chapters. They were different, all right. The lessons, in Rora's view, were not in logical order. Yet the problems were mixed, from all sorts of different lessons, precisely the approach he thought would help his own students. He let it drop. Rora was ready to walk away from math teaching altogether, and entered graduate school in experimental psychology. It was in 2002, 8 years after he finished his degree, that he again began to think about learning. For one thing, he'd read the 1992 Schmidt-Bjork paper on motor and verbal learning, and he returned to the central problem he'd had while teaching high schoolers. His students didn't need to remember more. Their weakness was distinguishing between problem types, and choosing the appropriate strategy. Mixing problem types looked like it might address just this weakness. We've done well so far to avoid doing any real math in this book, but I think it's time to break the seal. In the past decade, Rora and others have shown in a variety of experiments that interleaving can improve math comprehension across the board, no matter our age. Let's take a look at one of those studies, just to show how this technique works. We'll keep it light. This is 4th grade geometry, and a little review never hurt anyone. In 2007, Rora and Kelly Taylor, both at the University of South Florida, recruited 24 4th graders and gave each a tutorial on how to calculate the number of faces, edges, corners, and angles in a prism, given the number of base sides. The tutorial is self-explanatory and perfectly doable, even for people with math allergies. In the diagrams below, B is the number of base sides. Half the children performed blocked study. They worked 8 face problems, then 8 edge problems, 8 corner problems, and 8 angle problems in a row, with a 30-second break in between, all in the same day. The other half worked the same number of each type of problem, only in randomly mixed sets of 8, cf. for example, followed by car FX. The tutorials were identical for each group, and so were the problems. The only difference was the order, sequential in one group and mixed in the other. The next day the children took a test, which included one of each type of problem. Sure enough, those in the mixed study, interleaved, group did better, and it wasn't close, 77 to 38%. One fairly obvious reason that interleaving accelerates math learning in particular is that tests themselves, the cumulative exams, that is, are mixed sets of problems. If the test is a potpourri, it helps to make homework the same. There's much more going on than that, however. Mixing problems during study forces us to identify each type of problem and match it to the appropriate kind of solution. We are not only discriminating between the locks to be cracked, we are connecting each lock with the right key. The difficulty of pairing a problem with the appropriate procedure or concept is ubiquitous in mathematics, Rohrer and Taylor concluded. For example, the notorious difficulty of word problems is due partly to the fact that few word problems explicitly indicate which procedure or concept is appropriate. The word problem, if a bug crawls eastward for 8 inches and then crawls northward for 15 inches, how far is it from its starting point? Requires students to infer the need for the Pythagorean theorem. However, no such inference is required if the word problem appears immediately after a block of problems that explicitly indicate the need for the Pythagorean theorem. Thus, blocked practice can largely reduce the pedagogical value of the word problem. Rohrer puts it this way: if the homework says the quadratic formula at the top of the page, you just use that blindly. There's no need to ask whether it's appropriate. You know it is before doing the problem. The evidence so far suggests that interleaving is likely applicable not just to math, but to almost any topic or skill. Badminton, history, basketball, biology, piano, chemistry, skateboarding, blindfolded beanbag throwing, for heaven's sake. Certainly any material taught in a single semester, in any single course, is a ripe target for interleaving. You have to review the material anyway at some point. You have to learn to distinguish between a holy ton of terms, names, events, concepts, and formulas at exam time, or execute a fantastic number of perfect bow movements at recital. Why not practice the necessary discrimination skills incrementally, every time you sit down, rather than all at once when ramping up for a final test? As mentioned earlier, many musicians already do a version of mixed practice, splitting their sessions between, say, 30 minutes of scales, 30 minutes of reading new music, and 30 minutes of practicing familiar pieces. That's the right idea. Chopping that time into even smaller pieces, however, of 15 minutes, or 10, can produce better results. Remember, interleaving is not just about review but also discriminating between types of problems, moves, or concepts. For example, I still take classes when I can in Spanish and Spanish guitar. Every time I look at a list of new vocabulary words, I take that list and combine it with a list of at least as many older words. I do more kinds of mixing with the guitar. I do one scale, 2 or 3 times, then switch to a piece I know. Then I go back and try again the portions of that just played piece, let's say it's Granados's Spanish Dance No. 5, that I messed up. Play those 2 times, slowly. Then I'm onto a scale, followed by a few bars of a totally new piece I'm working on. Enough for one pass. I take a break and play a few riffs from the first tune I ever learned, Stairway to Heaven, and after that I'm ready to dive into Spanish classical. That is interleaving. And it's sure to be highly individual, far more effective for some subjects or skills than for others. The important thing to know is that you're essentially surrounding the new material or new skill set with older stuff you already know but haven't revisited in a while, whether it's a Jimmy Page solo or a painting by Georges Braque. As I read it, the science suggests that interleaving is, essentially, about preparing the brain for the unexpected. Serious climbers and hikers have a favorite phrase: it's not an adventure until something goes wrong. By wrong, they mean wrong. A rope snaps, the food supply flies overboard, a bear crawls into the tent. I think interleaving prepares us for a milder form of wrong. Every exam, every tournament, every match, every recital, there's always some wrinkle, some misplaced calculator or sudden headache, a glaring sun or an unexpected essay question. At bottom, interleaving is a way of building into our daily practice not only a dose of review but also an element of surprise. The brain is exquisitely tuned to pick up incongruities. All of our work tells us that, said Michael Inzellicht, a neuroscientist at the University of Toronto. Seeing something that's out of order or out of place wakes the brain up, in effect, and prompts the subconscious to process the information more deeply. Why is this here? Mixed-up practice doesn't just build overall dexterity and prompt active discrimination. It helps prepare us for life's curveballs, literal and figurative. Part 4. Tapping the Subconscious. Chapter 9. Learning without thinking. Harnessing perceptual discrimination. What's a good eye? You probably know someone who has one, for fashion, for photography, for antiques, for seeing a baseball. All of those skills are real, and they're special. But what are they? What's the eye doing in any one of those examples that makes it good? What's it reading, exactly? Take hitting a baseball. Players with a good eye are those who seem to have a sixth sense for the strike zone, who are somehow able to lay off pitches that come in a little too high or low, inside or outside, and swing only at those in the zone. Players, coaches, and scientists have all broken this ability down endlessly, so we can describe some of the crucial elements. Let's begin with the basics of hitting. A major league fastball comes in at upward of 90 miles per hour, from 60 feet, 6 inches away. The ball arrives at the plate in roughly 4/10 of a second, or 400 milliseconds. The brain needs about 2/3 of that time, 250 milliseconds, to make the decision whether to swing or not. In that time it needs to read the pitch, where it's going, how fast, whether it's going to sink or curve or rise as it approaches. Research shows that the batter himself isn't even aware whether he's swinging or not until the ball is about 10 feet away, and by that point, it's too late to make major adjustments, other than to hold up. A batter with a good eye makes an instantaneous, and almost always accurate, read. What's this snap judgment based on? Velocity is one variable, of course. The brain can make a rough estimate of that using the tiny change in the ball's image over that first 250 milliseconds. Stereoscopic vision evolved to compute, at incredible speed, all sorts of trajectories and certainly one coming toward our body. Still, how does the eye account for the spin of the ball, which alters the trajectory of the pitch? Hitters with a good eye have trouble describing that in any detail. Some talk about seeing a red dot, signaling a breaking ball, or a grayish blur, for a fastball. They say they focus only on the little patch in their field of vision where the pitcher's hand releases the ball, which helps them judge its probable trajectory. Yet that release point can vary, too. They may get a snapshot of the ball, plus something about the pitcher's body language. Stephen Sloman, a cognitive scientist at Brown University, told me. But we don't entirely understand it. A batting coach can tinker with a player's swing and mechanics, but no one can tell him how to see pitches better. That's one reason Major League Baseball players get paid like Major League Baseball players. And it's why we think of their visual acuity more as a gift than an expertise. We tell ourselves it's all about reflexes, all in the fast twitch fibers and brain synapses. They're naturals. We make a clear distinction between this kind of ability and expertise of the academic kind. Expertise is a matter of learning, of accumulating knowledge, of studying and careful thinking, of creating. It's built, not born. The culture itself makes the same distinction, too, between gifted athletes and productive scholars. Yet this distinction is also flawed in a fundamental way. And it blinds us to an aspect of learning that even scientists don't yet entirely understand. To flesh out this dimension and appreciate its importance, let's compare baseball stars to an equally exotic group of competitors, known more for their intellectual prowess than their ability to hit line drives, chess players. On a good day, a chess grandmaster can defeat the world's most advanced supercomputer, and this is no small thing. Every second, The computer can consider more than 200 million possible moves, and draw on a vast array of strategies developed by leading scientists and players. By contrast, a human player, even a grandmaster, considers about 4 move sequences per turn in any depth, playing out the likely series of parries and counter moves to follow. That's 4 per turn, not per second. Depending on the amount of time allotted for each turn, the computer might search 1 billion more possibilities than its human opponent. And still, the grandmaster often wins. How? The answer is not obvious. In a series of studies in the 1960s, a Dutch psychologist who was also himself a chess master, Adriaan de Groot, compared masters to novices and found no differences in the number of moves considered, the depth of each search, the series of countermoves played out, mentally, or the way players thought about the pieces. If anything, the masters searched fewer moves than the novices. But they could do one thing the novices could not: memorize a chess position after seeing the board for less than 5 seconds. One look, and they could reconstruct the arrangement of the pieces precisely, as if they'd taken a mental snapshot. In a follow-up study, a pair of researchers at Carnegie Mellon University, William G. Chase and Herbert A. Simon, showed that this skill had nothing to do with the capacity of the master's memory. Their short-term recall of things like numbers was no better than anyone else's. Yet they saw the chessboard in more meaningful chunks than the novices did. The superior performance of stronger players derives from the ability of those players to encode the position into larger perceptual chunks, each consisting of a familiar configuration of pieces, Chase and Simon concluded. Grandmasters have a good eye, too, just like baseball players, and they're no more able to describe it. If they could, it would quickly be programmed into the computer, and machines would rule the game. It's clear, though, that both ball players and grandmasters are doing more than merely seeing or doing some rough analysis. Their eyes, and the visual systems in their brains, are extracting the most meaningful set of clues from a vast visual tapestry, and doing so instantaneously. I think of this ability in terms of infrared photography. You see hot spots of information, live information, and everything else is dark. All experts, in arts, sciences, IT, mechanics, baseball, chess, what have you, eventually develop this kind of infrared lens to some extent. Like chess and baseball prodigies, they do it through career-long experience, making mistakes, building intuition. The rest of us, however, don't have a lifetime to invest in Chemistry 101 or music class. We'll take the good eye, but need to do it on the cheap, quick and dirty. When I was a kid, everyone's notebooks and textbooks, every margin of every sheet of lined paper in sight, was covered with doodles, graffiti letters, caricatures, signatures, band logos, mazes, 3D cubes. Everyone doodled, sometimes all class long, and the most common doodle of all was the squiggle. Those squiggles have a snowflake quality, they all look the same and yet each has its own identity when you think about it. Not that many people have. The common squiggle is less interesting than any nonsense syllable, which at least contains meaningful letters. It's virtually invisible, and in the late 1940s one young researcher recognized that quality as special. In some moment of playful or deep thinking, she decided that the humble squiggle was just the right tool to test a big idea. Eleanor Gibson came of age as a researcher in the middle of the 20th century, during what some call the stimulus response, or SR, era of psychology. Psychologists at the time were under the influence of behaviorism, which viewed learning as a pairing of a stimulus and response, the ringing of a bell before mealtime and salivation, in Ivan Pavlov's famous experiment. Their theories were rooted in work with animals, and included so-called operant conditioning, which rewarded a correct behavior with a treat and discouraged mistakes with mild electrical shocks. This SR conception of learning viewed the sights, sounds, and smells streaming through the senses as not particularly meaningful on their own. The brain provided that meaning by seeing connections. Most of us learn early in life, for instance, that making eye contact brings social approval, and screaming less so. We learn that when the family dog barks one way, it's registering excitement, another way, it senses danger. In the SR world, learning was a matter of making those associations, between senses and behaviors, causes and effects. Gibson was not a member of the SR fraternity. After graduating from Smith College in 1931, she entered graduate studies at Yale University hoping to work under the legendary primatologist Robert Yerkes. Yerkes refused. He wanted no women in his lab and made it extremely clear to me that I wasn't wanted there, Gibson said years later. She eventually found a place with Clark Hull, an influential behaviorist known for his work with rats in mazes, where she sharpened her grasp of experimental methods, and became convinced that there wasn't much more left to learn about conditioned reflexes. Hull and his contemporaries had done some landmark experiments, but the SR paradigm itself limited the types of questions a researcher could ask. If you were studying only stimuli and responses, that's all you'd see. The field, Gibson believed, was completely overlooking something fundamental: discrimination. How the brain learns to detect minute differences in sights, sounds, or textures. Before linking different names to distinct people, for example, children have to be able to distinguish between the sounds of those names, between Ron and Don, Fluffy and Scruffy. That's one of the first steps we take in making sense of the world. In hindsight, this seems an obvious point. Yet it took years for her to get anyone to listen. In 1948, her husband, himself a prominent psychologist at Smith, got an offer from Cornell University, and the couple moved to Ithaca, New York. Gibson soon got the opportunity to study learning in young children, and that's when she saw that her gut feeling about discrimination learning was correct. In some of her early studies at Cornell, she found that children between the ages of 3 and 7 could learn to distinguish standard letters, like a D or a V, from misshapen ones, like. These kids had no idea what the letters represented, they weren't making associations between a stimulus and response. Still, they quickly developed a knack for detecting subtle differences in the figures they studied. And it was this work that led to the now classic doodle experiment, which Gibson conducted with her husband in 1949. The Gibsons called the doodles nonsense scribbles, and the purpose of the study was to test how quickly people could discriminate between similar ones. They brought 32 adults and children into their lab, one at a time, and showed each a single doodle on a flashcard. The study had the feel of a card trick. After displaying the target doodle for 5 seconds, the experimenters slipped it into a deck of 34 similar flashcards. Some of the items in the pack are exact replicas, tell me which ones, they said, and then began showing each card, one at a time, for 3 seconds. In fact, the deck contained 4 exact replicas, and 30 near replicas. The skill the Gibsons were measuring is the same one we use to learn a new alphabet, at any age, whether Chinese characters, chemistry shorthand, or music notation. To read even a simple melody, you have to be able to distinguish an A from a B flat on the clef. Mandarin is chicken scratch until you can discriminate between hundreds of similar figures. We've all made these distinctions expertly, most obviously when learning letters in our native tongue as young children. After that happens and we begin reading words and sentences, after we began chunking, in the same way the chess masters do, we forget how hard it was to learn all those letters in the first place, never mind linking them to their corresponding sounds and blending them together into words and ideas. In their doodle experiment, the Gibsons gave the participants no feedback, no you got it or try agains. They were interested purely in whether the eye was learning. And so it was. The adults in the experiment needed about 3 times through, on average, to score perfectly, identifying all 4 of the exact replicas without making a single error. The older children, between 9 and 11 years old, needed 5, the younger ones, between 6 and 8 years old, needed 7. These people weren't making SR associations, in the way that psychologists assumed that most learning happened. Nor were their brains, as the English philosopher John Locke famously argued in the 17th century, empty vessels, passively accumulating sensations. No, their brains came equipped with evolved modules to make important, subtle discriminations, and to put those differing symbols into categories. Let us consider the possibility of rejecting Locke's assumption altogether, the Gibsons wrote. Perhaps all knowledge comes through the senses in an even simpler way than John Locke was able to conceive, by way of variations, shadings, and subtleties of energy. That is, the brain doesn't solely learn to perceive by picking up on tiny differences in what it sees, hears, smells, or feels. In this experiment and a series of subsequent ones, with mice, cats, children, and adults, Gibson showed that it also perceives to learn. It takes the differences it has detected between similar-looking notes or letters or figures, and uses those to help decipher new, previously unseen material. Once you've got middle C nailed on the treble clef, you use it as a benchmark for nearby notes. When you nail the A an octave higher, you use that to read its neighbors, and so on. This discrimination learning builds on itself, the brain hoarding the benchmarks and signatures it eventually uses to read larger and larger chunks of information. In 1969, Eleanor Gibson published Principles of Perceptual Learning and Development, a book that brought together all her work and established a new branch of psychology, perceptual learning. Perceptual learning, she wrote, is not a passive absorption, but an active process, in the sense that exploring and searching for perception itself is active. We do not just see, we look, we do not just hear, we listen. Perceptual learning is self-regulated, in the sense that modification occurs without the necessity of external reinforcement. It is stimulus-oriented, with the goal of extracting and reducing the information simulation. Discovery of distinctive features and structure in the world is fundamental in the achievement of this goal. This quote is so packed with information that we need to stop and read closely to catch it all. Perceptual learning is active. Our eyes are searching for the right clues. Automatically, no external reinforcement or help required. We have to pay attention, of course, but we don't need to turn it on or tune it in. It's self-correcting, it tunes itself. The system works to find the most critical perceptual signatures and filter out the rest. Baseball players see only the flares of motion that are relevant to judging a pitch's trajectory, nothing else. The masters in Chase and Simon's chess study considered fewer moves than the novices, because they developed such a good eye that it instantly pared down their choices, making it easier to find the most effective parry. And these are just visual examples. Gibson's conception of perceptual learning applied to all the senses, hearing, smell, taste, and feel, as well as vision. Only in the past decade or so have scientists begun to exploit Gibson's findings, for the benefit of the rest of us. The flying conditions above Martha's Vineyard can change on a dime. Even when clouds are sparse, a haze often settles over the island that, after nightfall, can disorient an inexperienced pilot. That's apparently what happened just after 9:40 p.m. on July 16, 1999, when John Kennedy Jr. crashed his Piper Saratoga into the ocean 7 miles offshore, killing himself, his wife, and her sister. There was no horizon and no light, said another pilot who'd flown over the island that night. I turned left toward the vineyard to see if it was visible but could see no lights of any kind nor any evidence of the island. I thought the island might have suffered a power failure. The official investigation into the crash found that Kennedy had 55 hours of experience flying at night, and that he didn't have an instrument rating at all. In pilot's language, that means he was still learning and not yet certified to fly in zero visibility, using only the plane's instrument panel as a guide. The instruments on small aircraft traditionally include 6 main dials. One tracks altitude, another speed through the air. A third, the directional gyro, is like a compass. A fourth measures vertical speed. 2 others depict a miniature airplane and show banking of the plane and its turning rate through space, respectively. Learning to read any one of them is easy, even if you've never seen an instrument panel before. It's harder, however, to read them all in one sweep and to make the right call on what they mean collectively. Are you descending? Are you level? This is tricky for amateur pilots to do on a clear day, never mind in zero visibility. Add in communicating with the tower via radio, reading aviation charts, checking fuel levels, preparing landing gear, and other vital tasks. It's a multitasking adventure you don't want to have, not without a lot of training. This point was not lost on Philip Kelman, a cognitive scientist at Bryn Mawr College, when he was learning to fly in the 1980s. As he moved through his training, studying for aviation tests, practicing on instrument simulators, logging airtime with instructors, it struck him that flying was mostly about perception and action. Reflexes. Once in the air, his instructors could see patterns that he could not. Coming in for landing, an instructor may say to the student, "You are too high." Kelman, who's now at UCLA, told me, the instructor is actually seeing an angle between the aircraft and the intended landing point, which is formed by the flight path and the ground. The student can't see this at all. In many perceptual situations like this one, the novice is essentially blind to patterns that the expert has come to see at a glance. That glance took into account all of the instruments at once, as well as the view out the windshield. To hone that ability, it took hundreds of hours of flying time, and Kelman saw that the skill was not as straightforward as it seemed on the ground. Sometimes a dial would stick, or swing back and forth, creating a confusing picture. Were you level, as one dial indicated, or in a banking turn, like another suggested? Here's how Kelman describes the experience of learning to read all this data at once with an instructor. While flying in the clouds, the trainee in the left seat struggles as each gauge seems to have a mind of its own. One by one, he laboriously fixates on each one. After a few seconds on one gauge, he comprehends how it has strayed and corrects, perhaps with a jerk guaranteed to set up the next fluctuation. Yawning, the instructor in the right seat looks over at the panel and sees at a glance that the student has wandered off of the assigned altitude by 200 feet but at least has not yet turned the plane upside down. Kelman is an expert in visual perception. This was his territory. He began to wonder if there was a quicker way for students to at least get a feel for the instrument panel before trying to do everything at once at 1,000 feet. If you developed a gut instinct for the panel, then the experience in the air might not be so stressful. You'd know what the instruments were saying and could concentrate on other things, like communicating with the tower. The training shortcut Kelman developed is what he calls a Perceptual Learning Module, or PLM. It's a computer program that gives instrument panel lessons, a video game, basically, but with a specific purpose. The student sees a display of the 6 dials and has to decide quickly what those dials are saying collectively. There are 7 choices: straight and level, straight climb, descending turn, level turn, climbing turn, straight descent, and the worrisome instrument conflict, when one dial is stuck. In a 1994 test run of the module, he and Mary K. Kaiser of the NASA Ames Research Center brought in 10 beginners with 0 training and 4 pilots with flying experience ranging from 500 to 2,500 hours. Each participant received a brief introduction to the instruments, and then the training began, 9 sessions, 24 presentations on the same module, with short breaks in between. The participants saw, on the screen, an instrument panel, below which were the 7 choices. If the participant chose the wrong answer, which novices tend to do at the beginning, the screen burped and provided the right one. The correct answer elicited a chime. Then the next screen popped up, another set of dials, with the same set of 7 choices. After 1 hour, even the experienced pilots had improved, becoming faster and more accurate in their reading. The novices' scores took off. After 1 hour, they could read the panels as well as pilots with an average of 1,000 flying hours. They'd built the same reading skill, at least on ground, in 1/1000th of the time. Kelman and Kaiser performed a similar experiment with a module designed to improve visual navigation using aviation charts, and achieved similar results. A striking outcome of both PLMs is that naive subjects after training performed as accurately and reliably faster than pilots before training, they wrote. The large improvements attained after modest amounts of training in these aviation PLMs suggest that the approach has promise for accelerating the acquisition of skills in aviation and other training contexts. Those contexts include any field of study or expertise that involves making distinctions. Is that a rhombus or a trapezoid? An oak tree or a maple? The Chinese symbol for family or house. A positive sloping line or a negative sloping one? Computer PLMs as Kelman and others have designed them are visual, fast-paced, and focused on classifying images. Do the elevated bumps in that rash show shingles, eczema, or psoriasis? Or problems rather than solving them outright? The modules are intended to sharpen snap judgments, perceptual skills, so that you know what you're looking at without having to explain why, at least not right away. In effect, the PLMs build perceptual intuition when they work. And they have, mostly, in several recent studies. In one, at the University of Virginia, researchers used a perceptual learning model